Well, Ian, Ernesto, ladies and gentlemen, I'm doubly delighted to be here at Yale this afternoon. Firstly, because I'm in the company of my old friend Ernesto Zedillo. I have known President Zedillo for many years, and he is one of a too rare breed, a man who gives politics a good name. So it's always a pleasure to see him. And it was a delight to accept his invitation to visit this famous old university once again. And it's also a special delight and privilege to deliver the George Herbert Walker III Lecture. In my years in politics, George Herbert Walker Bush was a very close ally, notably during the first Gulf War, and became a lifelong friend to cherish. George Bush is a citizen of the world and respected in every part of it. When I became Prime Minister, George Bush was the first person to phone me up from Air Force One. There was a slight glitch. He got my brother and the conversation went slightly awry. But he was my brother was wondering who he was. And said to the cook in the kitchen, "There's a Mr. Bush on the phone. Do we know him?" And I was dragged out of an adjacent room in order to speak to the president. And then when I ceased to be Prime Minister, George Bush was pretty much the first person on the phone, yet again, with an invitation to join him and Barbara at Kennebunkport. George, like Ernesto, is a friend for all seasons. So for George and Ernesto, I do almost anything, but I do draw the line at jumping out of aircraft on my birthday. Even for George. Now, my theme this afternoon is the quite extraordinary ways in which the world is changing and what that means for the future. And let me try and firstly put it in some sort of context. My father died 50 years ago. Since then, the world has changed beyond recognition. 50 years ago, the Soviet Union and the United States were the two superpowers. China was isolationist. Japan had barely begun her post-war rise. Central and Eastern Europe was still under Soviet control. Germany was still a divided nation. Latin America was a continent of revolutions. The European Union was in its infancy. The Gulf was undeveloped. Much of Africa was still colonized. Oil was $3 a barrel, and no one foresaw an Islamic revolution. Little of that world now survives, and the pace of change is accelerating within the span of one lifetime. My father, were he here, would simply not recognize today's world. And neither would people who left politics, quite senior politics, much more recently. Someone both George Bush and I knew very well was Boris Yeltsin. Now, Yeltsin ruled Russia 15 years ago, but now seems in many ways part of an age that is wholly gone. So much has changed. Boris had a great gift for many things, among them brevity and irony. I remember walking with him once in the Kremlin, and we were talking. This would be in the mid-1990s, and I said to him, "Boris, tell me in one word, what is the state of Russia?" He said, "Good." I was surprised it was falling to pieces. I said, "Tell me in 2 words." He said, "Not good." Even since then, the world has moved on. Nothing is as it was. And in the future, nothing will be as it is. The great challenge is to identify the changes that are to come and use them and try and take advantage of them. Now, you may say, but we don't know what is to come. In fact, we know a good deal more about the future than we realize. When Shakespeare put the words, "Nothing comes from nothing," into King Lear's mouth, he spoke an eternal truth. Change rarely comes as a bolt from the blue. It's a result of trends we have overlooked, or sometimes policy that we have ourselves implemented. And I suppose as evidence of that assertion, I offer the economic problems we've been facing in the last couple of years. They are the result of an unrestrained boom. Business and political leadership failed us. We enjoyed the boom, but we did not prepare for the aftermath. And as a result, the outlook for all the mature economies, America, Britain, the Eurozone, Japan, who for this purpose and this purpose only is an honorary Westerner, the outlook for the mature economies is at best sluggish. Consumer demand is fragile. Banks are cautious about lending as they repair balance sheets. Public spending is anemic. Unemployment is stubbornly high. Now, this is a result of policy failures, and it brings into stark relief a trend that has been developing for decades. Other economies, in what we quaintly and rather patronizingly call the third world, though I have myself in 40 years of politics never discovered what the second world is, the third world is catching up on the dominance that we have enjoyed for so long. China, India, Brazil, Turkey, Mexico, Indonesia are all coming into much greater prominence and will continue to do so in the decades that lie immediately ahead. Now, as Westerners, we may regret our shrinking preeminence, but it does create a better balanced and very probably a safer world than we have previously known. And in one way, the development of these new nations, their economic rise, is very helpful to us. It's emerging markets that will help refloat the Western economies. And it's led to something I certainly never expected to see in my lifetime, China funding the American deficit. But you and I had better get used to novelties like that, because the growth of the emerging nations has now passed the point where it is likely to be reversible. And our future world will be different, wholly different, as a result of that. Now, I don't propose this afternoon, though you may at question time, I don't propose this afternoon to focus on economic changes, but we should note them. The growing flow of wealth from west to east, the growing role of sovereign wealth funds, which is huge, the scramble for commodities, particularly perhaps in Africa, and the price inflation in them that is very likely to follow. All these are trends already clearly signposted for the future. I do want just for a moment, though, to touch upon the interdependence of nations, where there is one trend, one mini-trend, that I hope is not going to develop. Over the past 2 decades, the concept of free trade has become almost universal. Countries that once were collectivist, even communist, embraced free enterprise and prospered as a result of it. The impact of the financial crisis has put a very large question mark over that development in the minds of some of the people running these countries. A body called Global Trade Alert has reported a very significant growth in trade protection. Not sufficiently serious yet for us to be neurotic about it, but sufficiently widespread to be worrying. A growth in protection that needs watching. Because if more countries adopt protectionist measures, particularly if they are big countries, most particularly of all if they happen to be the United States, then protection amongst trade rivals will grow. Rivals will retaliate, and that could snowball and have a significant effect on world trade. And we'd be wise to remember that it wasn't the Wall Street crash in the late 1920s that caused the depression throughout the 1930s. It was the policies of protection that followed the Wall Street crash that actually caused the greatest damage. And the growth of trade for America, for example, world trade for America, did not get back to its pre-Wall Street crash level for over 2 decades. So there is a problem there that we need to keep a very close eye on. Now, what I would like to do is to look at the world that is to come. And I'd like to start with the most basic issue of all, mankind itself. In the 41 years since America landed a man on the moon, world population has doubled in 41 years. It now grows by as much every 12 years as it grew in the 1900 years between the birth of Christ and the dawn of the 20th century. Now that is a startling statistic, and a very important one in many ways, because the trend is accelerating. By 2050, and there are many people in this room who are going to be around in 2050, though I'm not at all sure I will be among them, but by 2050, not very far away in planning terms, our world population will soar to over 9 billion souls. This is an increase from today that is the equivalent of 2 more Chinas. Contemplate that. These are not just statistics. They're people, men, women, children, with hopes, fears, ambitions, and needs. Needs for food, water, clothing, education, housing, jobs, and every basic of life. And while we meet here this afternoon, pretty much 1/2 of the world goes hungry, ill-educated, and often without hope. How much worse may the problem be with an additional 2 billion to care for, 95% of whom will be born in countries that are very poor? So planning for this world needs to begin now. Politicians are so often focused on what is immediately ahead of them because you, the electorate, demand that they are, apart from their own wish to be re-elected. But unless around the world people begin to lift their eyes and look at some of these longer-term trends, we are going to be in very serious trouble when the projections we can now see become the reality that is the day-to-day contemporary problem that politics and nations begin themselves to face. Now let me give you an illustration of the sort of planning that needs to be done. Already, many parts of the Middle East and North Africa face water shortages. Water shortages for families, for agriculture, and for industry. In North Africa, the River Nile has been the supply of water since the dawn of time. But the demands on the Nile will one day become unsupportable. Consider this. In 1900, 5 million Sudanese depended upon the Nile. Today, it is over 42 million. And by 2050, it will be a minimum of 50 million. And similar statistics, not quite so stark perhaps, apply to every other country alongside the Nile. And the relevance of this is that action is required now to ensure adequate water in 30 or 40 years' time. And if no one begins to act now, the problem will be so great that it will be too late when water shortages become immediate and become acute. Now, these population projections aren't fantasy. They are reality. But they could become a nightmare unless we prepare for them. Now, as population changes, so does the future of our world. So does technology. My grandfather, who was in Pittsburgh in the 1860s and 1870s helping to build the Carnegie Steelworks, my grandfather never conceived of the combustion engine, let alone aeroplanes. He never conceived of the telephone, let alone mobiles. And now we have rockets in space and satellites, and they arouse almost no interest among the populace as a whole. So what is life going to be like for our grandchildren, given that change is accelerating? We can't know, but we do know the trend of change. Technology is moving ever faster. It's getting smaller and more powerful. It's getting cheaper and more accessible. It took the telephone 50 years to reach 1/4 of the population of America. 50 years. It's taken Facebook and Google less than 3 years to reach every single corner of the world. Now, science isn't emotional. It deals in facts. 700 years ago, it told us the Earth wasn't spherical and was not the center of the universe. At the time, the Christian church killed people for such heresy, but science was right. And now science and technology is the unstoppable motor that is changing every aspect of our lives. Consider what it has done. The first integrated circuit, invented by a man called Jack Kilby at Texas Instruments in 1958, proved to be the forerunner of silicon chips containing literally billions of microscopic circuit elements. Nothing, no single invention in the 20th century so accelerated change. It led to the computer revolution, to the digital age. Without that crude circuit board, there would be no Silicon Valley, no internet, no laptop, no Google, no iPods, no iPads, no Blackberries, no PlayStations, and none of the hundreds of millions of jobs that they created. So who knows what challenges lie ahead? Perhaps, for example, to take one example of many, as a result of the particle beams circulating in the Large Hadron Collider at CERN in Switzerland. Just last week, just a few days ago, scientists captured antimatter for the very first time, although only a few grains and only for 1/10 of 1 second. But it had never happened before. And this may, I emphasize may, be a new frontier. It was antimatter, you may recall, that powered the USS Enterprise in Star Trek. Fantasy is becoming reality. Now, as science changes how we live, medical science is changing the quality and the length of our lives. 110 years ago, no one knew of blood groups or hormones or barbiturates. Since then, medicine has given birth to whole new industries. New technologies are delivering better drugs, healthy food, new pesticides, the control of pollution, and advances in forensic medicine. Technology and medicine are old partners. The first man to assert that blood circulates and is pumped from the heart was William Harvey. But it wasn't until the discovery of the microscope in the 1650s that this was verified by the determination that there were tiny connections between arteries and veins. Now, in a modern parallel, scientists are examining how to combine computer chip technology with pharmaceutical research so they can target drugs to treat specific parts of the body. Imagine, for example, chemotherapy so targeted to the root of the problem that it had only minimal side effects. Now, science like this is leading to a revolution in medical care. Advances in engineering techniques have given us insulin pumps for diabetes, cochlear implants for deafness, and there are realistic prospects of repairing nerve cells for sufferers of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease. It may soon be possible to produce artificial heart muscle cells. And stem cell research? Stem cell research may enable us to grow replacement body parts. experiments in San Diego, in laboratories in San Diego, have already grown a human bladder. We can expect further advances. Just about a decade ago, scientists mapped the human genome system. We are daily learning more about how we live and why we die. On the day that mapping was announced, I was lunching with some eminent medical surgeons at one of Britain's great teaching hospitals, Addenbrooke's in Cambridge. And we talked about it. What does this mean? I asked the scientists who were gathered there. And it means, they told me, that medicine may determine in a child how that child may die as an adult. And knowing that, they can determine the treatment that may delay that death significantly. The lifespan, they added, for a new baby, born in a country with an advanced medical system that uses the science that is now available, the lifespan for that baby may rise from the 79 to 81 years average of today to well into the 90s. Consider the social and other implications of that development. Already, life expectancy is rising for 4 months in every year. It will accelerate. Now, just a few years ago, all of this would have seemed like black magic. Very soon, fantasy will become reality in a world we are only barely beginning to glimpse. Now, change, of course, is almost always two-faced. Sometimes it brings risk. Sometimes it brings danger. Consider our Earth, our blue and green planet. It's altered over the years. Continents have drifted. Oceans have been formed. Africa and South America, once joined together, split asunder. Species have evolved and become extinct. Now, these changes happened over literally hundreds of millions of years. But a few thousand years ago, like everything else in our modern life, it all began to speed up. Agriculture began. Vegetation changed. The growing population began to deplete raw and rare materials. Now, in the last few decades, we began to emit radio waves from television. Radar and cell phones and carbon dioxide emissions have absolutely soared. Planes have filled the skies, and missiles, satellites, and spacecraft have been propelled beyond our biosphere into orbit. For the first time in the long lifetime of the Earth, our way of life can affect the future of our planet. Now, this is the defining challenge for the future. Can we utilize the science that has given us these innovations to protect our way of life from the effects of those innovations? And once more, a single contemporary example may suffice. Science tells us that the risks of climate change are real. Arctic summer ice is disappearing faster than we thought. Without it, the sea absorbs the sun and melts the permafrost that keeps the lid on greenhouse gases. The burning of fossil fuels continues to raise dioxides. Most, not all, but most scientists expect this to lead to global warming of between 2 and 5 degrees. Doesn't sound much, does it? Does it matter? Yes, it does. Because NASA tells us that when temperatures last rose 2 to 3%, which they did 35 million years ago, sea levels rose by 25 meters. Even 5 meters would swamp large parts of London, New York, Sydney, Vancouver, Mumbai, and Tokyo. Regions of Florida, Louisiana, never mind Bangladesh and the Netherlands, would vanish. Singapore would sink. So no wonder green energy is such a growing business. But here is the dilemma for the policymakers. Our modern world is powered by energy. It's indispensable for political and economic stability. A world without readily available energy is a world that cannot power industry, light homes, cook food, drive cars. It would be chaotic. Without energy, we return to life before the Industrial Revolution. It's unthinkable and it's unimaginable. Now we, and by we I don't just mean this nation, the developed nations of the world, have been shamefully wasteful of our energy resources in the last half century and are now paying heavily for it. I referred to oil at $3 a barrel. It's now 80 and rising as demand has grown and grown. And it won't slacken. Demand cannot slacken as Latin America, Africa, and Asia continue to industrialize and as population continues to grow. So the role of science is going to be pivotal. It must mitigate the impact of fossil fuel degradation and prepare for the post-fossil fuel age. Now, this is still many decades ahead of us, but one day it will come. Already, science is far advanced in effective measures of capturing and storing carbon before it leaks into the atmosphere, although many of the worst polluters around the world haven't got, or if they have got, don't utilize the technology that is now available. We're looking at alternative sources of energy, solar energy, advanced biofuels, fusion, other renewables. All of them have a role to play. And so does the safe expansion of nuclear power, probably a bigger role than any of the others, which an increasing number of nations, not least in the Middle East, see as essential to future prosperity. And we also need science to do something that seems a little more mundane, and that is to finalize the electrical car to reduce CO2 emissions. An estimated 100 million cars are sold every year, and there will next year be an incredible 1 billion cars on the planet. An electric motor can make a significant difference to the emission of CO2. Now, challenges like this are daunting. So is the cost. But we dare not ignore them. If we take no action, my generation will be fine. We won't be seriously inconvenienced, but our children and our grandchildren may face a disastrous scenario. Now, as we look ahead, there are acute political and social challenges in nearly every nation in the world. The rising cost of caring for more elderly people, the provision of pensions for them in retirement, sufficient leisure and work to keep minds occupied and life worthwhile. Such challenges will do more than alter the number and length of our lives. They may change almost everything that is familiar to us. Now, as we prepare for what lies ahead, it's reassuring to recall the past challenges that have been met. For most of my lifetime, the world was at risk. At risk because NATO and the Warsaw Pact were facing one another with nuclear arsenals that, if unleashed, could destroy much of life as we know it. Reason and wise politics, not least from past American presidents like George Bush, prevented such a catastrophe. Today, intercontinental carnage on that sort of scale is very, 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 very unlikely. But if the world is safer, the dangers of proliferation of nuclear weapons, of regional conflicts, and of terrorism loom much larger as viable risks. Winston Churchill once referred to Russia as a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. Much the same could be said of Iran today. Since the flawed re-election of President Ahmadinejad, there has been widespread internal dissent by hundreds of thousands of individual Iranians. There have been marches coded speeches, intellectual dissent, as liberty has raised its voice. And the regime has responded, as we might have expected, with repression. But like others before them, they will find that the demand for change, for something better, for a free and open society, is impossible to smother forever. You cannot arrest freedom and put it in jail. But the fear of a nuclear Iran is a real fear. So is the effect of a nuclear Iran. The evil is not just that they have a weapon that they might use. The evil is that if Iran obtains a weapon, the risk of proliferation is very, very high indeed. Iran worries everyone and destabilizes much of the Middle East. Now, why is Iran doing this? The economy is in a mess. The currency is weak. Inflation, interest rates, and unemployment are all very high. It's a very sad come down for a nation that had a great empire when the British and Americans still lived in mud huts. Now, nothing is explicable in Iran without understanding the nature of the regime. It is nationalist and hardline. And the real source of power is a supreme leader backed by the Revolutionary Guards, the army, the intelligence services, and the police. The president, Ahmadinejad, so often the face of Iran, is in truth a secondary figure. He's not the decisive decision maker. Too many people overreact to his provocative remarks without realizing his subordinate position. He's the apprentice, not the sorcerer, the monkey, not the organ grinder. So what should we do? I think first to remember the regime is not the nation, as the internal dissent in Iran makes vividly clear. And even so, while the clerical regime survives, we have to deal with it. It is possible. Negotiations may improve relations, and of course we should continue to try. But because of the threat she poses, we must supplement dialogue with incentives and sanctions. Some advocate military conflict. And unattractive though that is in every conceivable way, we cannot absolutely and emphatically rule that out. But for the time being, sanctions and political pressure seem the right way forward, and we can only hope that they are sufficient. And then, of course, in the Middle East, there's the dispute, the Arab-Israeli dispute, that colors the world's view of the Middle East. It spills beyond its own borders, and it has scarred politics for decades. And is it not absurd that we know the two-state solution we seek, but cannot turn it into reality? Morality, as well as practicality, says that we need a solution. After several decades, a bilateral negotiated settlement is still far away. Many wonder whether it will ever be possible. Attempts at incremental agreements, confidence building in the jargon, have failed again and again and again. Peace negotiations, remind me of nothing so much as the mating of the black widow spider. Once the dance is over, death and destruction invariably follow. How often have we seen that? And how damaging is it, both to Israel and to the Palestinians and to the wider region? The present situation is close to stalemate. Palestinians are split. Secular Fatah control the West Bank. Islamic Hamas rule in Gaza. Hamas deny the right of Israel even to exist. They won't renounce violence nor accept previous agreements made by Palestinian negotiators. Meanwhile, Israel builds settlements that the world deems illegal. Is there a solution? Of course. The obvious one, a negotiated settlement. But if that can't be achieved, if negotiators from Israel and the Palestinians cannot make the concessions necessary to compromise because of their internal politics, what then? For how long can the international community allow this dispute to run on and on? Will the time come when the risk becomes so great that in the wider interest they have no choice other than to press more firmly their own ideas for a settlement? The protagonists would hate this. Understandably, we would if we were in their position. But if both sides take positions that impede progress, what alternatives exist? For the impact of this dispute spreads more widely than simply in their own territories. Will it be difficult? Of course it will. It's a gamble, a high toss of the coin, and one that will require great political courage with all concerned. But in the Middle East, as much as anywhere, and more importantly than in most parts of the world, statesmanship is essential if the region is to fulfill its potential without fear of conflict, and if Israel is to remain safe in the decades that lie ahead. Now, one conflict is now worldwide. It's important to understand that terror, Al-Qaeda being an example, threatens Muslim societies as much as, and in some cases more than, Christian societies. Al-Qaeda hate the Saudi Arabians more than they loathe the Americans, the British, and the Europeans. The Taliban, too, would change society back to pre-enlightened days with a rigid approach to religion and civil life that is abhorrent to most people. We have seen vivid and terrifying examples of that intolerance recently in both Iran and Pakistan. The concept of stoning a woman to death or executing another because she actually had the temerity to advocate and be proud of her Christianity is something that to us seems to come out of an age many centuries ago, but still exists in parts of the world. Now, this battle against intolerance and unreason is one in which every state has an interest. It isn't a short-term conflict, nor one capable of a clear-cut, finite ending. It is too complex, too chaotic for that. But it is one from which no nation can safely exclude itself. We all have an interest in the outcome, for it is our future that will be scarred unless we find solutions to these problems. Let me, before we turn to questions, offer one final thought about the future. Sometimes, in politics and in life, it's necessary to stand back and take stock. Now is such a moment. Our world has many complexities, but more opportunities. If we arrange our affairs to take advantage of them, our future can be so much more promising than even the most pessimistic can believe. Sometimes I think we should be more aware, more self-confident of what we can do. Young men and women today, here at this university, will do things, see things, know things, be things that their parents and grandparents would never have dreamed of. We must make sure that they can take advantage of those opportunities. Much of what I've had to say in the last few minutes has been about science. So let me conclude with a quote from the man Voltaire called the father of modern science. In the preface to his essays, Francis Bacon, a philosopher in Elizabethan England, observed, and I quote, "We have planted things that are likely to last." We have planted things that are likely to last. So have we, in our time, planted things that are likely to last. Throughout history, change has been an ally. In the future, if we are wise, it will continue to be so. Thank you very much.